In a dust-covered library, untouched by urgency, the silent guardian walks between forgotten shelves. The world outside moves quickly, but here nothing competes. No notifications, no interruptions, no noise pretending to be importance. The air is still, and the silence does not feel empty. It feels intact. Among the abandoned texts, there is one scroll rarely opened. It does not speak of distraction. It speaks of something deeper, fragmentation, and it begins with a warning. What is divided cannot become whole. There was a time when losing focus required effort. You had to leave the room, close the book, turn away. Today, it requires nothing. You wake up, and before your mind gathers itself, it is already elsewhere. A message, a headline, a suggestion, a vibration, a passing curiosity. None of these feel dangerous. That is why they work. Fragmentation does not feel like damage. It feels like participation. It feels like being informed. It feels like staying connected. But beneath that surface, something quieter is happening. You switch between thoughts before completing them. You begin conversations without finishing your own inner sentences. You open tabs in your mind and never close them. Ideas remain half-formed. Emotions remain half-processed. Decisions remain half-considered. The scroll describes this clearly. Division repeated becomes identity. Slowly, you stop noticing that you are no longer fully anywhere. Not fully at work. Not fully in conversation. Not fully resting. Not fully alone. Even in silence, your mind rehearses, anticipates, scrolls through invisible corridors of unfinished stimuli. Your attention is always partially elsewhere, and something subtle begins to erode. Not your intelligence, not your capability, but your depth. The guardian once stood in a narrow corridor, holding a torch. The flame flickered softly. Behind him, his shadow stretched across the stone wall. But as the flame trembled, the shadow distorted, longer, uneven, unstable. The scroll explains. The unstable flame creates a distorted shape. Your attention is the flame. The shadow is the shape of your identity. When the flame trembles constantly, the shadow cannot remain steady. You start reacting faster, thinking less deeply, feeling more scattered. You respond before reflecting. You speak before understanding. You move before deciding. You call it stress, but it is division. You call it productivity, but it is dispersion. You call it multitasking, but it is fragmentation. And the more it repeats, the more natural it feels. Until stillness becomes uncomfortable. Silence feels empty. Depth feels inefficient. A slow conversation feels exhausting. A long task feels unbearable. You reach for stimulation, not because you want it, but because you no longer know how to remain without it. Fragmentation has a cost. Not loud, not immediate, but cumulative. You struggle to read long texts. You struggle to stay with complex ideas. You struggle to remain in difficult conversations. You struggle to tolerate ambiguity. Not because you lack intelligence, but because your attention has been trained to move before depth can form. Depth requires continuity. It requires staying long enough for resistance to dissolve. But fragmentation interrupts that process. It replaces immersion with sampling. It replaces continuity with fragments. The scroll writes, a divided mind cannot build strength. Strength requires continuity. Continuity requires presence. Presence requires the ability to remain. Fragmentation does not attack your intelligence. It weakens your continuity. And without continuity, identity becomes reactive. You begin to define yourself by what interrupts you, by what trends, by what provokes, by what demands immediate response. Your inner voice becomes quieter than the external signal. The scroll does not accuse, it observes. In ancient times, control required walls. Today, it requires dispersion. A scattered population is easier to influence than a focused one. A divided attention span is easier to redirect than a steady one. When you cannot stay with one idea long enough, you cannot examine it deeply. When you cannot examine deeply, you accept surface explanations. Surface explanations are efficient. Depth is disruptive. Fragmentation is profitable. It feeds systems built on engagement, urgency, reaction. But it does not feed you. And yet, the scroll does not end in warning. It ends in restoration. It says, wholeness is not built. It is recovered. Fragmentation is not your nature. It is conditioning. And conditioning can be interrupted. You do not regain yourself in one dramatic moment. You regain yourself in small acts of continuity. Finish one thought before opening another. Complete one task before dividing your focus. Stay in one conversation without reaching for distraction. Read one page without switching. Sit with one feeling without numbing it. Listen fully before preparing your reply. Each act seems small, almost invisible, but each act gathers what was scattered. Every moment of sustained attention strengthens the flame. You are not trying to become someone new. You are reclaiming what was already whole. The world competes for your attention, but only you decide where it rests. Not through force, not through isolation, but through deliberate presence. The flame does not need to burn brighter. It needs to burn steadier. And steadiness changes everything. When attention stabilizes, thought becomes deeper. When thought becomes deeper, choice becomes clearer. When choice becomes clearer, identity becomes stronger. You do not need more information. You need more continuity. Continuity begins the moment you choose to remain. The guardian lowers the torch slightly. The flame no longer trembles. The shadow behind him is steady, defined, proportional, no longer distorted by instability. The scroll closes with one final line. What you protect with attention becomes whole. The world will not become quieter. The invitations to divide your focus will not disappear, but you can become steadier. And steadiness is power. If this message reached you, it means your attention gathered long enough to hear it. This was the Scroll of Fragmentation. The next scroll appears when the flame stops shaking. The knowledge does not sleep. It only waits.